The deputy had one hand resting against my front door when he told me the HOA wanted a copy of my house key. And standing beside him, smiling like she had already won, was Marla Whitmore, president of Silver Pine Estates. My 16-year-old son, Caleb, was halfway down the stairs behind me, barefoot and silent, while snow piled against the porch rail, and the deputy said, "Sir, this will go easier if you cooperate." I looked at the door my wife and I had hung together 15 years earlier. Then I looked at Marla, and I said, "Officer, before anybody gets a key to my home, I would like your supervisor's name, your incident number, and the exact law you believe gives this woman the right to enter my house." My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 54 years old that winter, and before moving permanently to the mountains, I had spent 26 years designing security systems for a company in Seattle that most people would recognize from the little blue windows on their computer screens. I was not a billionaire. I did not own a private jet, and I had never enjoyed explaining my job at parties. Because the moment you tell people you work in cybersecurity, they either ask you to fix their printer or assume you can read their text messages from across the room. What I actually did was much less glamorous and much more useful. I helped build systems that decide who is allowed inside, who is kept outside, and what happens when somebody lies about being authorized. My wife, Elise, used to say I trusted machines because people came with too many undocumented features. She was probably right. Elise died from ovarian cancer in June of 2022. After 24 years of marriage, and before she died, she made me promise I would take Caleb to the cabin we had owned outside Estes Park since he was a toddler. It sat at just over 8,000 feet, tucked beneath a ridge of lodgepole pine and granite, with a narrow view of the valley and a porch Elise loved because the afternoon light turned the whole western sky copper. We moved there full-time the following spring. I thought grief would be quieter in the mountains. It was not. Grief is loud everywhere. It just has different acoustics. In Seattle, it sounded like hospital elevators and unopened mail. In Colorado, it sounded like wind against the chimney and Caleb opening the kitchen drawer where Elise's old recipe cards were still tied with blue string. Silver Pine Estates was a private community of about 200 homes, spread across several winding roads, and for the first week, it seemed harmless enough, until Marla Whitmore came up my driveway carrying a lemon loaf and a black leather binder. She was in her early 50s, blonde hair, cream-colored coat, expensive boots, and the kind of smile that made you feel as though you had already signed something you had not read. "Welcome to Silver Pine, Mr. Mercer," she said, holding out the loaf with one hand and tapping the binder with the other. "We maintain an emergency access registry for all homeowners. I will need a copy of your front door key by Monday." I asked her whether it was required. "Absolutely," she said without blinking. Section 8.4. Every responsible homeowner complies. I thanked her for the loaf, told her I would review the covenant, and close the door. She stood on the porch for 3 seconds longer than a normal person would, then called through the wood, "Monday, Mr. E. Mercer." I spent the next morning reading the governing documents. Section 8.4 did not require homeowners to surrender keys. It said owners may voluntarily provide emergency access information to the association office. May is a small word, but in legal language, small words carry heavy loads. I emailed Marla a polite response quoting the section. She replied 20 minutes later with one sentence: "Your interpretation is incorrect." 3 days later, I received a violation notice for non-compliance, a $200 fine, and a daily penalty of $25. Then came a complaint about my porch light, another about the color of my firewood cover, and one accusing Caleb of operating an unauthorized mechanical device because he had been tuning his mountain bike in the garage with the door open. That last one almost made me laugh. Almost. I answered every notice by certified mail, cited the relevant Colorado statutes, and began keeping a file. Caleb watched the folder grow on the kitchen table until one evening he asked, "Dad, why does she care so much about our key?" I told him I did not know. What I did not tell him was that I had spent my adult life studying access control, and legitimate people do not become angry when denied access they do not need. Martha escalated. She called the county sheriff and persuaded Deputy Ryan Cole to accompany her to my house. That was how they ended up on my porch in late October. with Marla holding a clipboard and the deputy looking increasingly uncomfortable as I asked him to identify a law that allowed a private association to seize personal property. He could not. I asked him to identify any language in the covenant that made the key mandatory. He could not. Marla cut in, her voice suddenly sharp. "This is exactly the attitude that ruins communities," she said. "People move here and decide the rules do not apply to them." I looked at her clipboard. "No," I said. "People like you write down the word voluntary and then behave as though nobody will read it." The deputy shifted his weight and told me, quietly, that resisting the HOA could make things difficult. That sentence changed the entire direction of my life for the next 4 months. I requested the body camera footage before lunch, and the next morning I drove to a locksmith in Lyons named Everett Shaw, a 63-year-old former Army mechanic with thick glasses in a shop that smelled like metal shavings and burnt coffee. When I mentioned Silver Pine, he stopped turning the small brass cylinder in his hand. He asked whether Marla had demanded my key. I said yes. Everett leaned back and said, "You are the 8th person I know who said no." Then he told me something that made the room feel colder. 3 homeowners who had refused the registry had been burglarized within 6 weeks. 4 who had handed over keys had reported jewelry, cash, or family heirlooms missing, but none had been able to prove forced entry. I drove home with a biometric deadbolt, 3 exterior cameras, a network recorder, and Everett's private phone number. Caleb helped me install everything that weekend. By Sunday night, our front door no longer accepted an ordinary key, and every unfamiliar face on the porch triggered a silent alert. At 4:32 the following Thursday morning, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. I opened the camera feed and saw Marla Whitmore standing outside in a dark coat, holding a ring of keys in one gloved hand, trying them one by one against a lock that had no visible keyhole. She stayed there for 11 minutes. She checked the windows, tested the handle, and finally looked directly into the camera without realizing what it was. Then she walked back to her SUV and drove away with the headlights off. I watched the recording 3 times before sunrise. At 7:10, someone knocked again. This time it was an elderly woman from 2 houses down, standing in the snow with tears in her eyes and a photograph clutched against her coat. She looked past me into the house and said, "Mr. Mercer, I heard you refused to give Marla a key. I have been waiting 3 years for someone to do that." Her name was Evelyn Markham, 71 years old, a retired pediatric nurse who had lived in Silver Pine Estate since 2004, and the photograph in her hand showed a gold locket resting on the palm of a younger woman I later learned was her mother. Evelyn stepped into my kitchen, kept her coat buttoned all the way to her throat, and held the photograph with both hands as if the paper itself might be taken from her. She told me she had given Marla Whitmore a spare key 3 years earlier after Marla warned her that emergency crews might need access if she fell or stopped answering her phone. 6 months later, the locket disappeared from the cedar box beside her bed. There had been no broken window, no damaged lock, no footprints, no sign that anyone had entered at all. And when Evelyn mentioned it to Marla, Marla had leaned close and said, "You know, memory can become unreliable at your age." Evelyn looked down at her coffee when she repeated that sentence. I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. Theft was bad enough, but convincing an older woman to doubt her own mind was a different kind of cruelty, quieter, cleaner, and in some ways, harder to forgive. I turned my laptop toward her and played the footage from 4:32 that morning. Evelyn watched Marla try the keys, watched her test the windows, watched her stare directly into the camera, and when the video ended, she whispered, "That is the coat she wore when she came to check on me after my surgery." I asked whether she would be willing to make a statement. She looked at me for a long time, then said, "I will, but I do not want to go alone." I told her she would not have to. Caleb came into the kitchen carrying the plate of cinnamon rolls he had burned slightly because he was 16 and believed oven timers were a form of government overreach. Evelyn took one, smiled for the first time, and told him the burnt edge was the best part. By noon, Everett Shaw had called 2 more homeowners. By dinner, 3 people were sitting around my kitchen table. There was Martin Reyes, a widowed high school music teacher whose father's silver pocket watch had disappeared from a desk drawer, and Rachel Kim, a physical therapist who had lost a pair of diamond earrings after giving the HOA a key during a plumbing inspection. Neither had reported anything. Martin said he had blamed his grandson. Rachel said she had blamed the cleaning woman who had worked for her family for 6 years. The shame in her voice was immediate. She kept saying, "I fired her, Daniel. I actually fired her." I did not know what to say. So I said the only true thing I had. "Then we find out what happened, and after that, you make it right." Over the next 2 weeks, my kitchen became an unofficial intake office. People arrived after dark, parked down the road so Marla would not see their cars, and carried photographs, insurance records, old receipts, text messages, and stories they had kept quiet because each one, standing alone, sounded too small. A bracelet missing after a weekend in Denver, cash gone from an envelope during a hospital stay, a vintage camera taken from a lock study, a military medal that had belonged to a dead brother. Every household had either registered a key or been pressured to do so, and in nearly every case, the missing item had vanished while the owner was away at a time known to the HOA. I built a spreadsheet with dates, access history, property values, travel notices, service appointments, and Marla's own public calendar. Caleb sat beside me most nights, cross-checking neighborhood posts and highlighting patterns. At one point, he leaned back and said, "Dad, she is not just stealing. She is choosing people who will blame themselves." I looked at him and realized he was right. Elderly residents, widows, divorced parents, families with teenagers, anyone whose home already contained enough emotional confusion to make one missing object feel like a private failure. Marla had not simply found weak locks. She had found vulnerable narratives. That was when I stopped thinking of her as an overbearing HOA president and started thinking of her as a professional threat actor with a casserole dish. Everett introduced me to a former colleague named Simone Beck, a digital forensics consultant in Boulder who had once investigated an employee theft ring for my old company. She reviewed the footage, verified the metadata, and helped me create forensic copies with cryptographic hashes so no defense attorney could later claim the files had been edited. She also found something I had missed. At 4:39 in the video, Marla's phone screen briefly lit up, reflecting against the aluminum doorframe. Simone enhanced the reflection enough to identify a spreadsheet application, several address rows, and a column labeled "Away." That single word changed everything. I called an old friend from Seattle, Marcus Bell, who had spent 18 years with the FBI before moving into private security. Marcus listened without interrupting, then gave me the name of Assistant District Attorney Lena Ortiz in Boulder County, a prosecutor known for financial crimes and public corruption. Lena called me the next afternoon. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, which I had learned over the years was usually the voice serious people used when they already understood the size of the problem. She asked me to send the video, the spreadsheet, every certified letter, every fine notice, and the body camera footage from Deputy Cole's visit. 2 days later, she drove to my house with a state investigator named Owen Pike. They interviewed Evelyn first, then Martin, then Rachel. Caleb stayed upstairs, but I could hear the floorboards creak above us every time somebody described an item connected to a dead parent. When the interviews ended, Lena closed her notebook and said, "Daniel, this is no longer an HOA dispute." Then she told me not to confront Marla again, not to post the footage, and not to change my routine in any obvious way. The investigators wanted to know how the key registry worked, who had access, how travel dates were collected, and whether anyone inside the sheriff's office had helped. That last question bothered me more than the rest. Deputy Ryan Cole had not merely accompanied Marla to my door. He had tried to pressure me after admitting he could not identify any legal authority. When Lena pulled his personnel file, she discovered his sister, Paige Cole, had served as Silver Pines property manager for 5 years. Paige controlled the office schedule, the homeowner contact database, an emergency access cabinet where more than 100 labeled keys were stored. The conflict of interest had never been disclosed. A week later, state investigators obtained bank records for Marla and her husband, Douglas Whitmore, the original developer of Silver Pine Estates. What began as a burglar inquiry widened almost overnight. For 9 years, Douglas had been moving reserve funds through a landscaping company registered to a post office box in Wyoming. The HOA had paid that company more than $900,000 for tree removal, slope stabilization, and snow clearing that residents could not remember seeing. Some invoices listed work on roads that did not exist. Others charged the association for removing trees that were still standing. The key registry, Lena believed, gave Marla a secondary source of income and a private method of intimidating residents who questioned the finances. If someone demanded records, a keepsake disappeared. If someone challenged a fine, a door was found open. If someone refused the key program, they were buried under violations until they either moved or gave in. It was not random theft. It was governance by fear. Still, the investigators needed Brenda, or rather Marla, caught in a way no lawyer could explain as emergency access. I suggested announcing a ski trip. Lena suggested making it credible. So Caleb and I bought lift tickets, loaded the SUV in full view of Marla's favorite neighborhood volunteer, and posted a photograph from an old ski lodge with the caption, "Finally taking a few quiet days away." Everett had helped install identical biometric locks at Evelyn's house, Martin's house, and Rachel's house, each connected to a secure server in my basement. Simone configured silent alerts to my phone, Lena's phone, and Owen Pike's field unit. State officers took positions along the lower road. Deputy Cole's supervisor, Captain Teresa Walsh, joined the operation after reviewing the body camera footage and discovering Ryan had failed to file a complete report of his visit to my home. Caleb and I parked our SUV at Everett's shop, then hiked back through the trees after sunset carrying backpacks and snowshoes. We entered through the basement, turned off every visible light, and waited in the upstairs bedroom with 2 laptops open on the bed. Around midnight, Caleb whispered, "This feels illegal." I told him, "It would be illegal if we were breaking into somebody else's house." He nodded and said, "Good point." Then opened a bag of pretzels so loudly it sounded like a tree coming down. The first alert arrived at 1007 in the morning. Marla's face appeared on the screen outside Evelyn's house. She wore a black parka and carried the same key case, but she did not attempt the door. She stood there for 30 seconds, looked up at the new camera, then walked away. 7 minutes later, another alert came from Martin's house. Again she approached, saw the lock, and left. Then nothing happened for almost 40 minutes. Caleb started to think she had sensed the trap. I was beginning to agree when the camera at my driveway detected headlights moving without beams, just the faint glow of parking lamps through the snow. Marla's SUV stopped below the porch. She stepped out, followed by a tall man in work boots carrying a canvas tool bag. I recognized him from neighborhood photographs as Douglas Whitmore's younger brother, Wade, a contractor with 2 prior burglary arrests in Montana. Marla tried the old keys first, one after another, then hissed something I could not hear. Wade pulled out a cordless drill. Lena's voice came through the encrypted radio beside my laptop. "Do not move yet. We need contact with the lock." Wade placed the bit against the faceplate. The drill spun once, sharp and metallic in the quiet house, and before it completed a second turn, the trees around my porch exploded with white tactical lights. State investigators came up from the driveway. Captain Walsh from the east side, Lena behind them in a dark coat. Wade dropped the drill. Marla raised both hands and shouted, "This is my community. I have emergency authority." Lena stepped onto the porch and said, "Not at 2 in the morning, not with a mass contractor, and not with a drill." Marla looked through the glass and saw me standing in the hallway behind the locked door. For the first time since I had met her, her smile did not arrive before she did. It did not arrive at all. Lena arrested Marla on the porch at 1019 in the morning, Wade beside her with the drill lying in the snow between his boots. And I remember thinking how ordinary everything looked once the shouting stopped. The porch light glowing against the cedar siding, the little dent in the lock face, snow collecting on Marla's shoulders as Captain Walsh read her rights. Marla kept insisting there had been an emergency, though she could not explain what emergency required a masked contractor, a tool bag, and 3 attempts at 3 different empty homes before reaching mine. Wade said nothing. Men like Wade usually understand the value of silence before people like Marla do. Caleb stayed upstairs until Lena gave the signal, then came down wrapped in one of Elise's old wool blankets. His hair flattened on one side from leaning against the bedroom wall. He looked through the glass at Marla in handcuffs and whispered, "Mom would have made popcorn for this." I laughed before I could stop myself, then covered my mouth because there are moments when grief and relief share the same doorway, and you cannot always tell which one just walked in. The search warrants were executed before sunrise. Investigators entered the Whitmore house, the HOA office, Douglas's real estate company, and Paige Cole's property management office. Inside a locked cabinet in Marla's dressing room, they found velvet bags, jewelry boxes, Old coins, watches, military medals, and handwritten labels with residents' names and travel dates. Evelyn's locket was wrapped in a silk handkerchief inside the same black leather binder Marla had carried to my house with the lemon loaf. Martin's father's watch was in a desk drawer beside 3 blank HOA violation forms. Rachel's earrings were inside a small envelope labeled Kim, Denver Conference. At the lodge office, investigators recovered more than 100 house keys hanging from numbered hooks, along with a spreadsheet that tracked medical appointments, vacations, funerals, hospital stays, in which residents lived alone. The column Simone had seen reflected on Marla's phone was there in full, titled Away, with color codes for one night, weekend, extended travel, and uncertain return. Douglas Whitmore was arrested at Denver International Airport a few hours later while attempting to board a flight to Costa Rica. He had $68,000 in cash divided between 2 carry-on bags, several cashier's checks, and a folder containing the transfer documents for a beachfront condominium. His attorney later claimed the trip had been planned for months, which might have sounded more convincing if Douglas had not purchased the ticket 17 minutes after Marla called him from my porch. Deputy Ryan Cole was placed on administrative leave that morning. His body camera footage, call records, and messages showed that Paige had asked him to accompany Marla to my home because, in her words, Mercer needs to learn how things work up here. He had not participated in the thefts, as far as investigators could prove, but he had used his badge to help his sister and Marla pressure residents into compliance, and he had omitted their family connection from his incident report. He resigned 3 weeks later, one day before the county announced it intended to fire him. The strangest part of the entire story was how quickly fear evaporated once people realized they had been frightened together. By breakfast, Silver Pine's neighborhood page was overflowing with posts from residents comparing missing objects, unexplained entries, fines, threats, and suspicious visits. People who had barely waved to each other at mailboxes were suddenly sharing photographs and offering rides to the sheriff's office. Rachel found the cleaning woman she had fired, a woman named Ana Morales, and drove to her apartment with flowers, back pay, and an apology that lasted nearly an hour. Anna accepted the apology but not the flowers because, as she told Rachel, flowers die and trust needs more time. Rachel later rehired her at a higher wage. A week after the arrests, the community lodge held an emergency meeting. 163 residents filled a room rated for 150, with people standing against the walls and sitting on the windowsills. Everett wore a red flannel shirt and brought a folding chair from his shop. Evelyn sat in the front row with the recovered locket around her neck. Caleb ran the projector from a side table using Elisa's old laptop, the one with the tiny scratch near the trackpad from the time she dropped a coffee mug during a thunderstorm. I stood at the front and walked everyone through the evidence, not because Lena needed me to, but because the neighborhood did. I showed the voluntary language in the covenant, the pressure campaign that followed my refusal, the 4032 footage, the travel spreadsheet, the false invoices, and the reserve fund transfers. When the slide showing $900,000 in payments to a company with no employees appeared, someone in the back muttered, "Well, that explains why the road still looked like the moon." It was the first laugh of the evening, and after months of fear, it sounded almost rebellious. I ended with one sentence on the screen: "No private organization should possess unrestricted access to your home simply because it calls itself a community." The board dissolved the key registry by unanimous vote. Every stored key was placed in a sealed envelope and returned to its owner over the next 2 days. Marla was removed as president. H. Cole was fired as property manager. The association hired an independent accountant, published every contract online, and elected Evelyn Markham interim president because apparently surviving pediatric wards, widowhood, and Marla Whitmore had prepared her perfectly for HOA governance. Her first rule was simple: no meeting could last longer than 90 minutes unless somebody brought pie. Marla eventually pleaded guilty to burglary, theft, conspiracy, and theft from an at-risk adult. She received 7 years in state prison, with restitution ordered to every identified victim. Wade received 4 years for attempted burglary and possession of burglary tools. Douglas pleaded guilty in federal court to wire fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement, and was sentenced to 42 months while being ordered to repay the reserve fund. The landscaping company disappeared because it had never really existed. Everett installed biometric locks on 64 homes that winter. He charged only for materials, and I covered the cost for 14 residents who could not afford them. Caleb helped with the network setup and became so good at explaining digital security to older homeowners that the public library asked him to teach a monthly workshop. He called it "Your Password Is Not Your Dog's Name," which offended at least 9 dog owners but filled every seat. In February, Evelyn came to our porch holding a small wooden box. Inside was the spare key to her house. She said, "Daniel, I know you do not trust key registries." I told her I did not. She said, "Good, neither do I. This is not for a registry. This is for a neighbor." I took the key, then went inside and returned with ours. For the first time since Elise died, handing someone access to our home did not feel like surrender. It felt like trust, which is different because trust is given, never demanded. So tell me what you think. Was I right to set the trap? Or did I take things too far by turning my own home into bait? And if an HOA president showed up tomorrow asking for your house key in the name of community safety, would you hand it over, refuse politely, or change the locks before she reached the end of the driveway? Share your answer in the comments. Tell me what state you are watching from, and subscribe, because the next story begins with a retired firefighter, a blocked mountain road, and an HOA board that discovered far too late who actually owned the snowplow.